gave his insights on the issues we're discussing, especially the role of culture between the Americas and other pertinent issues in terms of trade and economic development. He's here to answer your questions. I would like to make one administrative announcement. Mr. Fuentes' lecture tonight will be at the same time, 6 p.m., but it will be at the Baker Institute building. It will be at the International Conference Facility in the Baker Institute building. It will not be in the original Hammond Hall, in the Baker Institute building in the International Conference Facility.
I gather that some of the questions will be in English and some will be in Spanish. So does everybody understand Spanish? So I gather that everybody understands English. Or do I have to make a resume of any Spanish answer?
I will need English for our session.
Yeah.
And,
You will need
and
English.
she will need Spanish.
All right, all right. That means I have to answer you girls twice.
Two different ways in the
Two
world.
different ways. Okay.
Ok, no sé si tenga pensado responder inmediatamente preguntas
Sí,
o
sí,
tenga
sí, sí,
alguna
no,
presentación.
a eso
Ok.
vengo, sí.
Bueno, básicamente hablamos sobre, primero la conferencia esta y sobre la realidad. ¿De verdad es posible tener una América unida a través de un tratado? ¿Y cuáles son sus implicaciones en todos los sentidos, señor Fuentes?
Bueno, yo no creo que se pueda tener ni una América unida, ni un México unido, ni un Estados Unidos unido, ni un Brasil unido. Creo que las naciones son plurales, una sociedad viva es siempre una sociedad pluralista, multicultural, todos somos encuentro de razas, encuentro de culturas, estamos hechos de muchas aportaciones. De manera que hablar de una unidad, como usted me la plantea, es un tanto abstracto, ¿verdad? Y si me hace usted una pregunta concreta sobre términos de comercio, supongo, pues claro que hay pesos específicos muy diferentes entre la economía más poderosa del mundo, que es la de los Estados Unidos, y la economía de un país, no diré de un país centroamericano, de México. El Producto Interno Bruto de México equivale al del estado de Ohio, nada más, ¿verdad? De manera que hay un gran desnivel, y de lo que se trata para nosotros en América Latina es de apurar el desarrollo, de tener un desarrollo más acelerado, un acceso justo al gran mercado norteamericano, un trato equitativo y sometido a reglas claras en cuanto a inversiones. Hemos sufrido mucho del llamado capital golondrino, el flight capital, que nos abandona a la primera señal de tormenta. En general estamos hablando de acuerdos de comercio que no pueden separarse de otro hecho que me parece muy importante, que es la ausencia de instituciones económicas y financieras internacionales a la altura de las exigencias y de la realidad del mundo de hoy. Cuando las instituciones financieras mundiales fueron creadas en Bretton Woods, al finalizar la Segunda Guerra Mundial, había 44 miembros fundadores. Hoy hay cerca de 200 naciones en el mundo. Y un sistema de comunicaciones, un sistema de transmisión de capitales, un sistema de contactos y de informaciones que no tiene nada que ver con lo que suponían el Fondo Monetario Internacional y el Banco Internacional de Reconstrucción y Fomento cuando fueron creados en Bretton Woods. De manera que tenemos que crear también nuevas instituciones internacionales a la altura de las exigencias del comercio, la tecnología y la inversión en el mundo actual.
Would you please summarize that in English? Especially your last point about the financial institutions.
Yeah, what I'm saying is that one cannot talk in abstract, as the question the young woman asked, of unity, of commercial or economic a unity in the Americas, since each country is different. We all have specific weights. Some countries are stronger than others. The United States is the strongest economy in the world. Only Ohio has a larger GNP than Mexico, than all the Republic of Mexico. So it is a question of establishing relationships that are based on free trade, but also on a sense of justice, of access to the great market of the United States, of certain commitments in the area of investments to avoid the disasters of flight capital that have affected so many countries in Latin America. And this, beyond the aspects of free trade you are discussing here, has to do with the Organization of World Financial Institutions. These were created at Bretton Woods at the end of World War II for 44 independent nations at the time. Today there are almost 200 independent nations and a wholly new system of communications, investment, needs, interrelationship between the economies that no longer obeys to the rather narrow horizons set forth by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank back in 1946-47. We had to recreate these institutions in order to respond to the needs of the world of today and certainly of the world of the 21st century.
What will Mexico want to be hearing from Clinton when he visits that country soon?
I think we would like to hear very clear and honest talk about the two paramount issues now affecting relations between our countries, which are drugs and migrant labor. Perhaps we would like to hear from him that the drug problem is a shared problem. It is not a question of blaming the supply while letting the demand go scot-free. The United States also should be certified or decertified. The certifier must certify itself, and it is not doing so. There would be no offer, no supply from Mexico or Colombia if there were not 20 million drug users demanding the drug in this country. The problem is there, and I think Mr. Clinton has an opportunity of setting the record straight in the sense that this is a shared problem. It is not a guilty party called Latin America and a sanctimoniously pure party called the United States of America. It simply isn't so, and Mr. Clinton would do a good deed if he clarified this point. The other is the question of migrant labor from Mexico. The series of laws that are being pushed through by very conservative elements in the United States are obscuring the fact that this country needs foreign labor, that there is work in this country that no one except the migrant worker will do, that the state of California produces 90%, produces one third of the agricultural produce of the United States, and that one third is harvested 90% by Mexican field workers, by Mexican migrant labor. There should be clear talk about this too. The Mexican worker is responding to a demand from the American economy. If he or she are not there, that work will not be done. These are workers. They have to be treated with respect. They have human rights. They're not criminals. They are workers. There should be a moment when the two countries sit down, and perhaps Mr. Clinton can make that proposal, and discuss this issue in a rational manner. In a rational manner. We cannot disguise the policies of labor in order to find a scapegoat for problems that are generated in the United States by the economy of the United States, by growing technology, automatization, by growing unemployment even in the third sector for workers that are no longer needed, by the incapacity to retrain workers and find a solution which is becoming a worldwide problem of what to do with the workforce in the developed countries. It is a problem that is shared by the United States and Western Europe right now. And to put the blame on Mexican workers and migrant workers for a problem that has its origins and must find its solutions within the industrialized Western capitalistic world, I think is a bum rap on Mexico. I think that's another question that should be discussed. Plus, a symbolic event. This is the 150th anniversary of President Polk's war against Mexico in 1847, when we lost half our national territory to the manifest destiny of the United States, and it coincides with President Clinton's visit. In 1930, 1947, 100 years after the war, President Truman was the first U.S. president ever to visit Mexico City. And he won the hearts and the minds of Mexicans by visiting the monument to the 15 cadets that fell to their deaths from the heights of Chapultepec Castle, rather than surrender the castle to the Yankee invader. And this gave President Truman an enormous popularity in Mexico. Perhaps on the 150th anniversary, President Clinton should also pay a visit to that monument.
Obviamente, señor Fuentes, a nosotros nos interesa también las expectativas de lo que es la visita del presidente Clinton a
Sí.
México. ¿Qué podemos esperar de esta visita?
Well,
En español.
En español, yo creo, sí, ya entiendo, tengo que repetir lo que acabo de decir. Quería irme por otro lado, pero no puedo.
No.
Estoy capturado. Yo creo que la visita del presidente Clinton va a requerir que se traten con mucha franqueza entre los dos gobiernos, entre los dos presidentes, dos temas principales de la relación México-americana. Uno es el problema del narcotráfico. No es posible que los Estados Unidos continúen acusando a la oferta sin hacerse cargo de la responsabilidad que les incumbe en cuanto a la demanda. No habría oferta de droga de parte de América Latina si no hubiese demanda de droga por parte de 20 millones de usuarios en los Estados Unidos. ¿Quién certifica al certificador? ¿Quién le va a dar un certificado a los Estados Unidos mientras sean ellos los principales responsables del comercio de drogas en este continente? Ese es el principal problema, uno de los principales. El otro para mí es el problema del trabajo migratorio mexicano. Un trabajo que no es gratuito, que es indispensable para el buen funcionamiento de la economía norteamericana. Los trabajadores mexicanos vienen a los Estados Unidos porque son requeridos por la economía norteamericana. Son requeridos por una economía que no podría funcionar sin ellos, que se desplomaría en muchos aspectos sin el concurso de esos trabajadores, que son trabajadores, no son criminales y tienen derechos humanos. El estado de California, ponía como ejemplo, produce la tercera parte del producto agrícola de los Estados Unidos y el 90% de ese producto es cosechado por trabajadores mexicanos. Retire usted a los trabajadores mexicanos y habría una escasez y en consecuencia una inflación en los Estados Unidos de la que ni siquiera pueden ustedes soñar. Y si algún día, como yo lo espero, ningún trabajador mexicano tenga que emigrar a los Estados Unidos porque tiene trabajo suficiente en nuestra patria, los Estados Unidos van a tener que buscar a esos trabajadores en algún lado, en Birmania, en el Caribe, en Turquestán, donde usted guste, pero van a necesitar esos trabajadores para mantener a la economía norteamericana.
Do you think that NAFTA is benefiting one country at the expense of another, basically the United States, sorry, Mexico?
NAFTA is basically both a debatable and a good agreement. It is debatable because perhaps there are certain aspects of the relationship that should have been included and have not been included. For example, work. Why can capital and goods flow freely and work cannot? In any case, the NAFTA treaty is now part of the law of both countries. And it is a law that can be made better. It is not a zero-sum game. During the final years of the Salinas administration, it benefited the United States. We were importing from the United States up to the sum of $50 billion a year, $5 billion a year from California, $3 billion from Texas, Arizona, Delaware, Kansas. Mexico was then in an importing binge that led it to the financial disaster left in the wake of the Salinas administration. Today, the treaty is benefiting Mexico because we are exporting more than we are importing from the United States. But so it goes in free trade. As I say, it's not a zero-sum game. It benefits at times one of the parties, at times the other. But free trade is a good principle in itself, and it tends to come out even in favor of all the parties concerned.
Now, there are some people in Mexico who fear that NAFTA might be causing a globalization of cultures in Mexico and might be hurting some of the indigenous civilizations there.
I don't think NAFTA is hurting the indigenous cultures of Mexico. I think Mexicans are hurting the indigenous cultures of Mexico because we despise them, because we ignore them, because they have to raise up in arms as Marcos did in Chiapas in order to be heard, and because this is a heavy charge on our consciousness. Even the Spanish colony dealt more humanely with the Indian cultures of Mexico, which most Mexicans like to see mostly in museums, but not in daily dealings with the actual peoples that live and speak and dream and work within a certain culture that demands our respect and an integration while preserving their tribal or their cultural characteristics. And if they are to be subsumed into the central mestizo current of Mexico, let it be so, but at the pace the Indian peoples determine, not at the pace that we determine from Mexico City.
Señor, en todos estos asuntos que usted menciona, la actitud del gobierno mexicano ha sido demasiado tibia y no ha sido la primera vez. ¿Qué es lo que se puede esperar no solo del gobierno norteamericano, sino del gobierno mexicano para solucionar estos problemas?
¿Cómo cuáles?
Como lo que es migración, narcotráfico.
Bueno, es de esperar. Mire, muchos de los problemas políticos de México van a tener solución mejor, entre ellos la relación con Estados Unidos, a medida que la democracia se afiance en México. Y no solamente el gobierno, y no solamente la sociedad, sino el Congreso, un Congreso pluralista, con representación de la oposición, sea capaz de exigir ciertas actitudes, de definir ciertas actitudes. Muchos de los problemas internacionales de los Estados Unidos, la ley Helms-Burton, por ejemplo, le pongo un ejemplo, pues vienen del Congreso, no son iniciativa del Ejecutivo, ¿verdad? De la misma manera, un Congreso pluralista en México podría tomar iniciativas, muchas de ellas iniciativas de defensa, que acaso le cueste más trabajo tomar al Ejecutivo, que tiene una relación diplomática con el gobierno de los Estados Unidos. Es la respuesta que podría dar.
Hay elecciones este año.
Importantísimas.
Se decide eso.
Hay elecciones importantísimas. Una de las elecciones más importantes de la historia de México, el 6 de julio de este año de 1997, en que se renueva la Cámara de Diputados, parte del Senado, algunas gobernaturas de estados, ayuntamientos y sobre todo, por primera vez se va a elegir al alcalde, es decir, al jefe de gobierno de la Ciudad de México. ¿Usted se imagina lo que es en un país centralista como México, con una ciudad que tiene 20 millones de habitantes, tener un alcalde electo responsable no ante el presidente de la República, sino ante sus electores? Trátese del candidato del PRI, Alfredo del Mazo, o de los candidatos de la oposición, Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas del PRD y Carlos Castillo del PAN, todos van a estar obligados con sus constituyentes, con sus electores, con sus votantes, y esto va a significar un cambio enorme tanto en la vida de la ciudad como en la vida política del país. Aparte de que por primera vez el Congreso o puede escapársele de las manos al Partido Revolucionario Institucional, o por lo menos puede haber un equilibrio entre los tres partidos que no hemos conocido en México. Es decir, que la dictadura perfecta de la que habla Mario Vargas Llosa, que para mí siempre ha sido una democracia imperfecta, pasa a ser una democracia un poco más perfecta de acuerdo con las elecciones del año actual. Ahora, existe el peligro de que los dinosaurios, es decir, los elementos reaccionarios del PRI y de la vida económica mexicana, reaccionen ante un cambio de la situación de la cual se han aprovechado durante 70 años. Pero esto sería lamentable para el país, sería una catástrofe para el país. Yo estoy seguro de que los ciudadanos la vamos a exorcizar mediante el uso del voto y el uso de la legítima defensa ciudadana para que las elecciones sean perfectamente transparentes y honestas. Yo quiero añadirle al respecto que durante el presente gobierno del presidente Zedillo ha habido 29 elecciones no disputadas en México. Las 29 elecciones a distintos niveles que han tenido lugar no han sido disputadas por nadie. Los resultados han sido respetados por los tres partidos principales. Esta es una ganancia enorme. Quiero decir también que en este momento el 40% de México está gobernado ya por la oposición. También es un hecho fundamental que no nos permite hablar de una dictadura monolítica del PRI como existía en el pasado.
Please tell us that and address that in English as far as what the status of Mexico is financially in the context of political stories of political corruption that we hear, through our press.
Well, that's
here in this
another
country.
question. That's another
Yes.
question. That's not his question.
Right.
So what is your question?
My question is, what is your assessment of the financial status of Mexico today in the context of the governmental corruption that has been reported through the media?
Well, the financial status of a country and the corruption of a country do not necessarily go together. Corruption has sometimes been called the oil that makes the machinery turn in any country of the world. I think the Emperor Moctezuma and his emissaries were as corrupt as any other regime we've had in Mexico. You know that it's an old story. In the 18th century, in the court of Charles III of Spain, corruption was known as the Mexican ointment. You greased the palms. It was so pervasive in the colony, in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, that it even had a Mexican name. But Mexico does not have the monopoly of corruption. As we have seen with the case of Collor de Mello in Brazil, the Manipuliti affair in Italy, multiple examples of corruption in Great Britain, in Germany, in Spain, in France, in the United States, of course, the Savings and Loans Associations, anything you want to mention, we do not have the monopoly. What is important in Mexico today is that corruption is bubbling up, that it is publicized, that we know about it, that the papers talk about it, that the corrupt are signaled out, that many of them go to jail. That is the novelty in Mexico, and that is what we have to fight for. Fight against corruption, but also to publicize the cases of corruption and to see that the law is applied. That is one question. The other question you made is about the general economic situation of the country. Now, the president, who is Zedillo, who is a very academic and traditional economist, has once more, as did his predecessor Carlos Salinas, staked it all on the macroeconomic growth of Mexico, with the illusion that if the macroeconomy grows, it will trickle down and benefit the majority of the population. Well, we've been living in trickle down for about 500 years, and it has never made the poor richer. It has made the rich richer. And I don't think it is the solution for Mexico. Nevertheless, there has been a certain ability in making the macroeconomic indexes of the country look far rosier, far better than they did when Zedillo had his crisis in November of 1994, when he came into power. But still, you have the other Mexico, the Mexico of extreme poverty, the Mexico of misery, the Mexico of a middle class that has suffered enormously from this economic crisis. I mean, the thousands of Mexican families of the middle class that can no longer pay the mortgage on the apartment, the monthly payment for the Volkswagen, or send the kids to a private school, the hundreds, if not thousands, of small and medium-sized industries that were broken, that were crushed by Mexico's rush into NAFTA and the support given by the government to giant Mexican businesses at the expense of the medium and small enterprises in the country, that because of their debt burden, because they could not respond to the export-import factors anymore, have been pulverized by the present crisis. Plus the enormous mass of poverty-stricken Mexicans that constitute a second Mexico, a Mexico that is invisible to many visitors, but that constitutes at least 60% of the population. And they see little hope. They do not see the light at the end of the tunnel. And it is they that we should worry about most.
There's one last question.
I have a question. There was a
But
big
you're
response
a-
to the
you're a big
Aldape case.
monopolist.
To change the subject, but this is very interesting to the Houston community. I think the Aldape Guerra case.
The-
The Aldape Guerra case.
I don't know it that well. You're going to excuse me for not going into it because I don't know it that well.
Okay.
Okay, bueno,
Another question?
Yeah, please, another
Yes, another
a
question.
different voice.
Las elecciones,
Monopolista.
las elecciones el 6 de julio,
Sí.
se ha hablado mucho de que en realidad las funciones de este nuevo gobernador están muy limitadas a la negociación a la que se llegó con todos los partidos, que no tiene, por ejemplo, poderes para escoger a su procurador, en fin, una serie de limitantes que en realidad diluyen mucho lo que sería un proceso democrático que comentó.
En cuanto al jefe del gobierno,
Sí.
sí, no, yo creo que va a tener bastante fuerza por el hecho mismo de haber sido electo. Si es una elección transparente y clara, eso mismo le va a dar una enorme fuerza. Ahora va a tener que tratar, que es lo que usted está implicando, con una burocracia. Y esa burocracia significa un desafío para México, porque tenemos que crear un servicio civil, un civil service, como lo tiene notablemente la Gran Bretaña o Francia. Y México lo ha tenido en los aspectos de Hacienda y Relaciones Exteriores. Pero vamos a tener que crear un servicio civil en una democracia para, en efecto, impedir que cuando un candidato de la oposición gane un puesto, tenga a la burocracia en contra de él, porque la burocracia está asociada con el gobierno o el PRI. Esto no puede ser. Tenemos que empezar a crear, para tener una democracia en México, un servicio civil independiente de los partidos, independientemente del Ejecutivo, que simplemente cumpla sus funciones de servidores civiles, como pasa en cualquier país civilizado del mundo. Es otra etapa más de la democracia que tenemos que ganar en México.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fuentes. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.